Well, welcome to the GA podcast. Right first time, how to be the perfect client and save yourself some money. Today I am joined by illustrious guests, an architectural designer who I've worked with and has been in industry for many, many years and works on some prestige jobs, Bob Shearer. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thank you, nice to be here.
Bob, it's you probably don't know the format, and this is probably ambush level very high because I know you've jumped in at the very last moment to come and join us, but I know your time's precious and you're busy, so I'm really grateful to have you here today. Maybe just tell the audience a little about what you've done. I know you've run architectural practice before, you've been involved in design. Just a little bit about what you do and where you're passionate about in the industry.
Okay, well, I haven't had a particularly illustrious career, but I've worked for a number of fairly solid commercial architects, and then ran the London office of a national practice for a few years until the 90s recession, where 40% of architects and designers were effectively unemployed. And so I started to do some small work on my own, and that built up to a kind of reasonably low-level sustainable income. And eventually I had a client who wanted glass-to-glass everything, and that's when I met you.
There is a theme with these things. It's glass-centric. Maybe that's what we should have called the podcast. We all seem to evolve and find each other through the medium of glass, which is or transparent architecture, as I like to call it.
Yeah.
So, what's the type of stuff that I love asking? What do you love about this industry? What do you love about our game and what you do?
I like the breadth of it. In other words, you've got, at a high level anyway, you have everything from philosophy to getting mud on your boots. Mm. So, what is the sort of the high purpose or social purpose or aesthetics behind what you're trying to do? What's it trying to say? Does it have any meaning, or what meaning can you find or make in it? Then you'll have to find a way of realizing that, finding materials that will do the job, all on a client's money.
Yeah.
So the important thing is to actually give the client more than he thought he could have.
Well, that's
so, and that means whether it's spatially or the rooms. I don't mean that he gets more square feet, because that's what he wants. But something he doesn't even realise that he's getting, that is kind of a bit and above and beyond the how many 1,000 square feet can you get, or how many can I get a downstairs loo. You've got to achieve those things, but it's also to have some part of that that's actually really nice to be in.
You talk about the philosophy, and I can, I've always felt this speaking to you over the years. There's always so much behind than just 2D or even 3D or even going forward into more BIM type stuff. There is this sort of profound nature, going back to architecture over the centuries. What is it that inspires you about the craft of actually putting together? I know you're really into the whole space and actually bringing in light and thermal and comfort into the whole space. But what is it that really gets you inspired about this type of thing?
It's actually working with others, because you don't know it all. In fact, you know squat by and large. And so, speaking to someone who really knows about glass or really knows about wood, and how that wood's going to move or age, or the pattern of time that will affect it, or the right polish to use, or the right joints. And you learn that. I've been doing this for 50 years, so it's sort of, I've learnt lots along the way. And it's also finding how to harness that fantastically deep knowledge base that we have with innovative ways of doing things or innovative visual results. Not that I go for innovation for its own sake, but certainly when you're trying to work against a tight budget, or the client changes his mind 14 times in the course of the construction, you're always up against innovating in order to mitigate the damage of that, which is considerable. So if a client wants to save money, don't change your mind.
Well, I mean, and that's nice little route back to, like some of the things we like to discuss on the show. It's like, if we were advising the client to be a perfect client and actually save themselves lots of money, what would be your top 3 tidbits that we could offer?
Well, you haven't actually given me any time to think about this, but the first thing is be prepared to explore and not just settle for what you think you want. That's the first thing. So find someone creative to work with and who can kind of help you realize what you want, but also open your mind to other possibilities. And the second thing is, once you've decided, then go for it. And the third thing is, once you're on site, never change your mind. Just, that will cost you money. And it isn't that people are trying to rip you off or anything. It's simply that once someone has set up a project to achieve a certain thing in a certain timescale, any disruption costs them money, and it costs them more money than if they had known in the first place. So to change a wardrobe from point A to point B or whatever, those are minor things, and maybe not all of it costs money or not all of it matters, but major things, you try to be try to stick to the decisions you made, because you made them carefully, because you've had this fantastic creative designer working with you, and so you've already thought that through, and there's no point in getting wobbly about it. It just costs you a load of dosh.
No, that's absolute, so succinct, and off the hoof. But I mean, that's grounded in years of experience. You must have seen that. I mean, that the change management piece in like the project management or the managing of any project is key. And but I think you're right. It's, and the theme of, as we go through these podcasts, is always think about, like spend a lot of time. It's almost like that. When people say, measure twice, cut once, and I think what you're saying is really have an explorative process, work with good people, good creative people, think about the materials, think about the space, think how you're going to use it before you then commit to it, and then don't change your mind. I think that's, we see so many, over the years, we've seen so many projects actually double or treble because someone's gone in the midst of the build. Actually, I'm going to change. We've heard about people moving lakes because of windows, and so I think if anyone listening here, if you take that on board, I don't know what value you'd put on it, but I think on a build on let's say if you're working on a domestic house on £500,000, you're easily going to save, I don't know, £50,000 to £100,000 just on that piece of advice there.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a good measure. What's your? I know another one of your big loves is sort of thermals and getting the U values right, and that's something that you've been exploring, and I know you've invested in technology, which is commendable, considering you've already, 50 years been doing it, but still learning and taking on new stuff. What would you like to say about that, or what can you bring in?
There's again at high level, it's saving the planet.
Yeah,
that's the first thing, and every single decision you make about a window frame, as that's what I've been designing recently, will affect the energy that the building uses. Every time you specify a piece of glass, every time you specify the insulation, there's a limit to how much people can afford to invest. But insofar as anyone can invest money on energy saving, it seems to me a no-brainer, really, in so much as you can afford it. To go over and above building regulation requirements. It saves you money in the long run. Some things have really quite a short payback period. Doubling the amount of insulation can have quite a short payback period. Putting on solar panels now doesn't have a very long payback period. So all of those things affect the overall size of a building because the walls are thicker or whatever. And so from a designer point of view, it's telling the client all that up front and not shilly-shallying. Now, the trouble is that people say, I don't want that, I just want this to the minimum building regulations. I want it done as fast as possible, as cheap as possible. So as a designer, I do keep some things close to my chest. I'm never lying to a client because that doesn't work ever. But you try and do the best you can.
So what you're saying is passive house and BREEAM aren't always being translated through to the domestic market.
Yeah.
But commercially, what do you think?
It's coming. I think the attitudes are changing, and that people are, are you prepared to have a smaller house in order to live with a lighter footprint on the planet? That's a.
Yeah, I mean, decarbonisation is something which it's a buzzword. It's obviously connected with different protocols to try and get the greenhouse gases down, and it's commendable. But then you've got, when you look at the big contributors, oil and shipping and the airline industry. Do you actually sometimes think, well, okay, we're just nibbling away at something, or do you think construction itself actually has a place in reducing our carbon footprint?
It has an enormous place in reducing our carbon footprint. I mean, I don't have the figures to hand, obviously, but the reuse of buildings or the reuse of materials, that has a phenomenal impact on carbon footprint. So refurbishing rather than building new, and then when building new, build back better. really build back better. Yeah. Build better, and build not with a 50-year life cycle. I mean, we have buildings which are hundreds of years old that we're still living in, and they're highly desirable. Very often multi-million pound properties because they're old. We could do with really upgrading our fabric as well as building better new fabric. And it does make a difference. It makes a difference because you incorporate energy saving measures, water saving measures, energy producing measures, all within new construction, if you carefully consider orientation and materials.
If you're sort of king for the day and talking to policymakers and people that could actually change and impact our built environment, what would be your wish list?
Firstly, to recognise the power of vested interest rather than interest in the future of the planet. So your decision making would have to be less by what you're pressured into deciding, by people whose whole companies may be destroyed if you pursue a particular environmental route, for instance. So a lot of the big companies, energy companies, are, to their credit actually, investing in non-carbon technology. They're using their vast wealth to do that, but they're doing it pretty slowly. And occasionally I get the impression that it's for PR purposes rather than actually deeply in their, it's not deeply rooted. Mm. So I think it's a question of It's not saying, oh, insulate every home in the UK, or that would be on the list. It would, one has to run the figures, but it seems to me, in a simplistic way, if you started at the north of Scotland and worked down, so where needs the most insulation most, and worked down and sort of just swept the country through with a complete energy package. The real problem is the implementation of those kind of drastic measures is almost always dire. It never actually works, and there's so much opportunity for corruption and not doing the job properly, and it's too big. So some way of breaking that down into a localised initiative, but it seems to me that's where the money has to go.
I mean, you're probably old enough to remember Clerk of Works, which I haven't seen a Clerk of Works on a site.
I was a junior Clerk of Works once.
Right. And I think, do you think that...
you wouldn't have had Grenfell
Yeah.
if you had a decent Clerk of Works.
Yeah, and do you think there's space and a place to bring back a Clerk of Works, or do you think there's, is it machine learning? Is that the new Clerk of Works, or where is there a
machine learning? I suppose clerks of works were worth their weight in gold because they had the authority. But what happened was the designer, the architects, engineers, and so on, used to have real authority. And I don't think that's really the case anymore in most, in the large construction schemes, because they're generally run by the builder. So the designer is pretty well purely a technician. I don't mean purely, but they're there for their technical expertise, but they're there to do what they're told, not to direct the works. So a clerk of works, under direction of effectively an independent person, is no longer part of the industrial structure. It may be true on small projects or domestic projects, but for the sort of mass house building and so on, I don't really know how that works, but certainly it's a place for someone who has authority to say, you can't cut this corner. There's a corner too far to cut. You've got to stop and do it properly. That's what they were doing. That's what Clerk of Works were doing. And also to make decisions on the hoof where something always comes up that you haven't considered. And they can make a decision there and then, and because they know the design and they know the designers, they know what a builder can do and what he can't do, they would make pretty good decisions by and large. So Clerks of Works, I'm surprised you brought it up actually, isn't it, before your time?
Maybe I was about 18 to 20, and I remember a Clerk of Works doing exactly that. He was the guy that was feared because he knew his stuff, he knew his craft, and he would be the guy that would, really consider whether that, as you said, a corner could be cut. And it wasn't probably a corner, it was probably he'd realised that, back then, things, it took 6 months before they got to site, and when they were on site, he didn't want to send them back because they took 6 months to come back to site. So he would be going, okay, well, I've considered it, I've consulted it. Yes, we can change the brick or the wood or the whatever that's going to be in place. And, I obviously in modern building techniques, and facades, there's always a juncture, there's always, and it's usually at the discretion of the installer. I've seen many installations that have been put in purely because we're in the industry that I'm in now, which is repair and maintenance, is we're going back and we're uncovering things that were maybe installed 20 years ago.
And you're glad you didn't install it, aren't you?
And I'm very glad that I didn't install it. And I've always taken pride in the whoever I've worked with and the installations that we've done, that it's been according to the drawings and really kept the whole theme. And if we had to sort of do any cutting and carving, it's been with a view that it's not going to leak, it's a decent repair. But some of the stuff that I've seen in the last 10 years has been shocking, absolutely shocking. I just can't believe. And yet, under the pressure cap, under the fascias, it all looks great. But as soon as you start peeling back, there have been newspapers and sticks of wood and expanding foam, which would have just like if it had caught fire, would have just taken the building down. So I've like it's as my career's evolved, I've really enjoyed the whole repair and maintenance. And my next the next thing that I'm sort of really getting my teeth into is the O&Ms. So the operation manuals, which actually you should go to, and it should tell you everything about it, not just how it was constructed, but the process of the repairing it, which is woeful. So but that's for another.
Well, that may be another, but actually it's part of this deal you were asking about. What would you do? And I think that one of the main things, you cannot reuse a building or a material if you don't know how to deconstruct it.
Yeah.
A bit like ideas, you need to deconstruct them sometimes to get at the root. So you need to have a dismantling procedure, and they're doing it in the car industry, aren't they? I don't know how far that's successful, but I think Volkswagen have made strides and so on. I'm sure the Japanese manufacturers will not be far behind, but I don't know. I'm not up to date with that. But we are not in the building industry. We are nowhere near getting to be able to recycle and reuse in a sensible way or a reusable way. Okay, we can take away a whole load of aluminium and melt it all down and reuse. Aluminium takes phenomenally high temperatures to actually melt and be able to reuse and make another product, which is another carbon consuming process.
Yeah.
Currently, anyway. So being able to dismantle and reuse things is, it's something until probably a decade ago I had never really thought about in designing buildings either. Mm-hmm. And it's something that, whether anyone will actually do that, but the fact is, if they can't, they won't.
Yeah.
And if they can, then 10% of them might.
I think I'm sensing that there's definitely an appetite. Whether there's retrofit awards or whether there are consultants, at some of the biggest sort of engineering companies around the world that are really thinking about standards and how to, the historic buildings we have in this country, probably across Europe, that need to be protected and need to be brought up to scale, and so they can be usable and appreciated by, for young people for centuries to come. But they do need, a special, that experience, that knowledge, that wisdom just needs to be funneled somehow, and that needs to be captured in a modern way, whether it's blockchain or whether it's some kind of repository. I know there's lots of people talking about digital stuff, and in Cambridge University they've got the CABD working on new digital twin type stuff. But how do we bring it from where some of the manuscripts of how these buildings were built, how do they get decoded from Old English into modern day technology? I think that's a challenge. It's where archaeology meets architecture almost.
It's an investment in time, and who's going to make that investment? That's the issue, isn't it?
Who do you think should make that investment? Do you think it's a government thing?
I think it's for the past, it's a government thing. I think, or government funding universities, and you'll get a lot of knowledge out of that and things that you'll learn, which you can then feed back into the future. I rather think that especially those products which are for the building industry, which are mass produced and become ubiquitous, they're basically everywhere. I think the manufacturers have a responsibility to provide some O&M manual, which includes the dismantling of that at the end of the building's life or at the end of the product's life, in a way which will maximise, or that they perceive would maximise, I think, the continuing use of the material. And that should perhaps be part of the O&M.
So I have an acronym called POINT, which we'll go through. So which is really about potential, opportunity, impact, needs, and transformation. So, and this is specifically really from your perspective, and it can be about anything. But where do you think is the greatest potential for change and improvement within the industry that you work, or from the area of the industry that you work?
The biggest necessity is education.
So that's need, but which will come. But where's the greatest potential? Where do you think is the biggest growth potential, or the potential for change that will better our planet going forward? Which area?
I don't know the answer to that one. I don't think I have an opinion even, because we're always wrong. Well, you predicted we need loads of engineers. You'd have predicted we need loads of this. Gradually, I think a lot of the design, certainly detailed design, I think AI will start to impinge on the sort of end level before manufacture detailed design. Mm-hmm. I think AI may well, not in the next decade, but in the following decades, start to erode those jobs. Okay,
so perhaps a potential,
sort of like the junior technicians in the drawing office.
Yeah.
So I think some of that will.
Okay, so there is a potential for working with collaborative with AI, and thinking, okay, I can put that to work and take out some of the time consuming things.
Yeah.
Too. Okay, so what about opportunities? What are some of the biggest opportunities that you're seeing coming through?
I think there'll be a degradation in lower level jobs in design as AI begins to impinge on those. But on the other hand, computer-aided design has enabled us to realise projects which only could previously exist in imagination, because they were simply too complex, either drawing-wise or engineering-wise, to communicate to the people who had to build them. Mm. And so you have CNC cutting. So you can basically take from a computer the instructions how to cut a piece of material or fold or bend a piece of material that a machine can do. So it's machine to machine.
Yeah.
And the complexity of trying to draw that previously would have been defeating. It would simply have defeated you to be able to communicate it to a craftsman.
Yeah.
So, which is why people built models, of course. Which is why people had whole model building workshops. Mm. But they still do, some of them, but much less, because you have 3D workshops created by your computer. So CGI has actually made a very, very big difference.
Yeah, I mean, the film
to the design of building. So there's the opportunity for new things. But I have an issue only with the effect that the untrammeled use of that, with the undisciplined use of that, is simply willful. And it's always something behind designing that I think, I'm not going to do that just because I feel like it. It may be that I'll twist the window a little, or I'll just shape something slightly differently because I find it more aesthetically satisfying. But the basic premise is always grounded in either need or logic or what the client's trying to achieve. Mm. So it's you need to have some rationale which underlies it, which gives you a discipline in order for it simply not to be
gratuitous,
completely random. Yeah.
I mean, so the impact. I mean, you're seeing probably AI impacting jobs, but also creating and making usability. And the whole Internet of Things, I imagine, is going to make the creating space and architecture and design and engineering that much more wholesome, I would have thought. But what impact do you think? Can you see anything that's going to negatively impact, for instance, the industry, or do you see just positive impacts?
It depends what you mean by negatively. I think there are sort of perfectly sort of okay jobs that will go, especially as more and more work's done off-site. Mm. So as most of the construction process becomes undertaken in a factory and simply assembled on site, large elements assembled on site, using mechanical means mostly, I think you'll find an awful lot of... That has a lot of advantages. You know, it has advantages of economy, of scale, of control of quality, and all of that sort of are all good, but jobs will go. So it'll be one of the many industries which will be effectively piling people onto the unemployment register. And that finding something for people to do is something meaningful for people to do. Not that continuous, rather mindless work is something always decent to do, but having a job is better than not having a job for most people.
Definitely.
I think, and so having a sort of the self-respect of earning money, and so I think I think that's actually one of the biggest consequences of all of these positive. Oh, and the other thing is entry into a market. So if everything is done in huge factories, where are the startups? You know, if you need £1 million of investment to even begin, where's the startup? The startups will all be virtual. They'll be in that world, not in the sort of physical world, or there'll be people reverting to the kind of, you know, hammer and plane and craft thing, which is fine, but then only the wealthy can afford those artifacts in the end, or that particular level of personal care and detail, because everything else is stamped out, built from a 3D printer.
I'm sensing some.
So that's a challenge, I think.
Yeah. So, okay, the final piece then is transformation. So, where is the transformation? Where do you think the transformation needs to be to actually lead us into a much better, fairer, encompassing world where people...
We're talking about generally or in the building industry?
Either, you know.
Well, starting with the building industry, if you have all of that power which has gone into, all of that investment's gone into the technology of production in order to make it the most economical production possible, in order to drive up standards, you still got to find a way of harnessing that in a way that doesn't dehumanize the spaces you're creating. Because the evidence, to my eyes, is that the spaces that are being created are leftover spaces from the production of the profit-making product, which is the building. And the leftover spaces, it takes actually some legislation and central government, or not central government, but local government control or community control, in order to harness it in a way which is not actually harmful to the environment that you're trying to save by using these economic low energy methods and economic low energy buildings. Once you get them en masse, you have to organise them into a way that give spaces in between the buildings which people can actually enjoy and live in. I think that's where there's a big opportunity and a big challenge, and it may be the area which AI cannot really call the shots. It'd be the making of coherent public space and the coherent division between the public, or gradation between public and private space. And as we seem to be hell-bent on entirely dismantling our planning system, that's actually the system which is best placed to do something on that. But the people who are in that then need to be educated in a way which also has that aim in view, not ticking boxes about whether you've achieved the exact gable height.
You heard it here first, Boris. Transformation of the planning system. As always, Bob, it's been really interesting. You've blown my mind with some of the concepts that I've had to just sort of get my head around. And hopefully we'll catch up again soon, because I know there's so many themes that we could capture. Again, thanks for coming in at such short notice. And viewers and audience, I hope you enjoyed that, and see you again for another show soon. Take care.